I invite you to join me in reading 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 16. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats, do not be frightened. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander.
We want to spend our time this morning thinking about these words from Peter that we just read. As I like to do when we start a lesson, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the background of this letter, and it won't be at length, but I think it's helpful. If you go back to 1 Peter 1, verse 1, you find that it begins with the words, from Peter, an apostle of Christ Jesus. That this, the authorship of this letter has from earliest times been, recognized as from one of those apostles who was, we often refer to as part of the inner circle with Jesus. Peter, the one who had great lessons to learn, great enthusiasm, but sometimes misdirected and kind of needing to get honed in a little bit on things that are a little bit more important. And he addresses it to God's elect, and we'll touch on that a little bit more, but calls them strangers in the world. And through this letter, Peter will use the idea for Christians that we don't really belong here. And that affects the way that we live here. If you think about how that works. But throughout the letter, and there are many things that he has in mind, and there's some very practical exhortations, but he expresses a concern for Christians who are living in a difficult and hostile world. So, in this tough world, he wants us to keep that identity as aliens and strangers. If you think about the idea that if you go somewhere, and you know that you're only going to be there, for example, a year, let's say you decide to go take a class somewhere, or you get a temporary position, or, you might think of any one of a number of other reasons, that when you get to that other place, you realize that I'm not here for forever. I'm here for a short period of time, and that often affects the choices that you make and the things that you do. And so if, as Christians, we understand that we are basically passing through this world. Now, you stop and think, we may live, some of us may live 80 or 90 years. Some may even live longer. And we think, that's a long time. But in the grand scheme of things, that's not very long, is it? Those of us who are over 60 now are realizing that it seems like yesterday we were teenagers. And now we're kind of looking at the other end of life. And so we realize that it's transient. It's temporary. And that changes your view of things. And so that becomes an important part of it. And so he says, if that's true, then, recognize that in the world there are these worldly desires. There are many people around us that are living in a way that just freely follows anything they want to do. And Peter's admonition or encouragement is, abstain from sinful desires because they wage war against your soul. We realize that many of these, all of these, are destructive. They affect our relationship with God. They reflect affect our relationship with other people. They're damaging to us, to our bodies. They're hurtful to other people. There are just so many implications to that. So Peter says, avoid them. And what I think is important here is that this is a self-monitoring thing. It's not that we go out living this rule book, so I can't do this, I can't do this, can't do this. But it's realizing that I'm learning to make discernments in life over what are the healthy things that promote my relationship with God and my spiritual growth, and those things that are destructive and harmful. And so he says, and these are all from chapter 2, he says, live such good lives among the pagans that they see your example. That's an important thing. That's an important way that the idea of the gospel, of Christ, is spread to other people. They see that there's a difference in Christians and the way Christians live. Now, that's threatening for some people. They don't like that. But no matter what happens, no matter what people do, no matter what they say, and what's really interesting here is Peter really gets down to some very specific ideas that if people treat you badly, follow the example of Jesus. He had people that abused him. He had people that said things about him. He had people that tried to get him into trouble. And how did he deal with it? He always did good. And so, Peter's theme about opposition and persecution, and look at some of the things that he will refer to. Unjust suffering. Especially there's the warning about the idea that, if you do wrong and you get punished, you're getting what you've sown, right? You're reaping the trouble that you've caused. But if you've done good and you're suffering, then you are following that example of Jesus. People who insult. What's interesting is you follow in the course of this book, in chapter 2, he shifts into talking about slaves and slaves being abused by their masters, and you kind of get the idea that, imagine you've got a Christian slave and a non-Christian master, and all of the problems that might come in because the master basically misunderstands and sees the slave as being more loyal to Jesus than to the master. And so the master abuses the slave. Well, next Peter goes to talk about husband and wife relationships. And I think if you read between the lines, there is especially this idea about marriages where one is a Christian and one is not, which would have happened especially in the early time of Christianity, when as people became Christians, one became a Christian and one didn't. Suffering, chapter 3, for doing right. Isn't that an interesting idea? That you're doing what you know you should be doing and other people don't like it. Other people are threatened by it. Abuse. Insult for the name of Christ. You know, you look at Peter's references here, he really paints a picture of a very hostile and difficult situation for Christians to be living in. There are people that are going to hate. There are people that are going to slander. There are people who are going to be malicious and demeaning and hurtful, and even people who are going to be physically violent. In this reading, did you notice the mention of threats? You know, Peter, having lived with Jesus and having seen what happened to him, would have seen and be very aware, and even through the challenges that he faced as we read the early chapters of the book of Acts, where Peter became an object of a lot of the opposition and persecution. He knows the hard road that it can be. And his concern is to communicate to other Christians that it's okay if things are hard and people mistreat you, because you have something that's better. And so his concern, and I want to suggest for these verses that we read, chapter 3, 8 to 16, kind of pulling those out of a little bit larger context, but that his focus is on then how Christians can stand under pressure. Now, the first thing you think about is, well, what happens when you have a community, a family, that's under the kind of pressure that he describes through this letter? And one of the things that often happens is they begin to turn on each other. That's certainly a possibility. And so his very first concern is living together in the body. And, you know, you look at that verse, you know, talking about love, living together in sympathy, living in harmony. In other words, that Christians don't allow the circumstances outside to change or alter what we are inside. Of doing good in the face of evil. Of trusting God. You know that, the way he puts it is, you know, refers to the eyes and the ears of God that are set on his people. Isn't that a wonderful idea? You know, I can remember as a kid, there used to be a song that, you know, kids sang in Sunday school, you know, there's a big eye watching you. And, you know, that kind of created a bit of paranoia. You know, you get that image of God just kind of watching over your shoulder. And that's kind of scary. But the way Peter creates that point is that the eyes of God are watching over his people. He's not sitting there waiting for us to make a mistake. He's there watching us, just as a parent watches a child. And the same thing, that his ears are turned toward us to hear us. You know, that's that confidence that John talks about, that if we ask anything in his name, he hears us. You know, that God is disposed favorably toward his people, so that no matter what's going on around, he's connecting with us. And so people who are eager to do good, and so we hold on to Jesus. But then comes the key verse that I really want to kind of impress on us this morning. The key verse says, "But in your hearts revere." Now, the earlier translations will say things like sanctify. set apart. The idea is probably to make a commitment to holding on to Jesus. So in your hearts, revere or set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. I want to ask you to read that with me, okay? But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. For me, that is and what has been a formative verse. I was fairly young when I heard a lesson talking about that verse. And as you think about what that suggests, you know, there are some powerful, powerful ideas. Now, so revere, set apart Jesus as Lord. You know, in other words, that, you know, it's not just have some good thoughts about Jesus. You know, people talk about taking Jesus as Lord. That's not like taking a pill. That is making Jesus the master. That's what that word Lord means. Making Jesus the master of our lives. So that's the first thing about dealing with this difficult environment, is that the only way I'm going to survive in the face of a culture or society or situation that is opposition to me and to my faith is I have to keep focused on that faith. But then to always be ready, always be prepared. I don't, you know, it's funny. I was involved with Scouts when kids were young. I was on the group committee. I wasn't running meetings with the kids, but and as you know, I was touching some roots in my life from when I was about 12, 13, involved in Scouts in the U.S. And the Scout motto was, be prepared. You know, and you think about what that entails, that you're ready for any situation. You know, and I think in the context of Scouting, because of the emphasis we had on things like first aid and service, and you know, there was that stereotypical thing of walking little old ladies across the street, and that we were always prepared to do something. Well, Peter has in mind here, always be prepared, always be ready. You know, that opportunities, situations are going to arise. And you know, sometimes if then you start trying to think about, okay, well, what am I going to say? That's kind of hard to do that. But if we've given thought to it before, then we have an idea where we're going to go and what we are going to do. So always be prepared to answer. Now, answer in the Greek here is a very interesting word. It is the word that we get apology from. I'm thinking about something I saw on Facebook yesterday, and I've seen it before, that kind of portrays Canadians. You know, this dialogue, for example, part of it was Canadians, you know, texting back and forth, and one says, "I'm sorry," the other says, "No, I'm sorry." No, I'm... And kind of that joke that Canadians are always willing to say, "I'm sorry." That's not what apology means. The idea of apology originally was the idea of of a verbal statement, a verbal defense. In other words, that what Peter is saying, that we need to be ready, and that's why they translate it to give an answer. In the area of, for example, we talk about the existence of God, and there are people who are what are called apologists. And what that means is that they specialize in preparing and presenting information to give evidence on why it is reasonable to believe in God. You know, what's there, what we have scientifically, what we have philosophically, you know, and all of those things that are very relevant to that. So what Peter is saying is always be ready to share the reasons for your faith. And the word reason, interestingly, it's the word, you know, it's the same word that's used back in John 1:1, talking about Jesus as the Word. And we understand that what he means there has more than the idea than the Greek word. There's another Greek word for word when we just want to talk about a word. But the word in John 1:1 is the idea of the message. Well, here it's a little bit more. It's the reason. And what's interesting, it is the word that logic comes from. So think about what that suggests about faith and sharing our faith. But it's the reason for the hope that you have within you. So there's some things that we can conclude about hope, and we'll go through this quite quickly. Number one, hope is more than a wish. You know, I think we need to understand that hope has a substance to it. Faith, the writer of Hebrews says, is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That hope, Paul says, that is seen is not hope, but yet hope is a driving force in the life of the Christian. It is not just a wishful thinking. And if you think about what this passage suggests, hope has reasons. And what he's talking about is being able to say and answer the question to people, why do you believe? I don't know, my parents taught me to. That's not going to lead you to cross the street. You know, how are you going to stand in the face of opposition, persecution, ridicule? See, I think it was Paul Little wrote 2 books a number of years ago. One is Know What You Believe, and then he followed that with Know Why You Believe. Why do you believe? Why do you profess Jesus is Lord of your life? And so if it has reasons, if you think about what Peter's saying, is that these can be explained and shared. You know, that's why it's so important for us to be prepared, to answer, to tell people what we believe and why we believe. You know, what is our hope? Hope is more powerful than all other influences or circumstances. See, Peter understands that that's how Christians are going to survive. And so I want to close with a passage here. It goes back to chapter 1 of 1 Peter. But if you think about what he is saying here, I think it kind of, in other words, Peter isn't just using hope in a very nebulous way. Listen to what he writes back at the very beginning as he speaks about how God has given us new birth into a living hope. And I could preach a whole sermon right here, but I won't. A living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Okay, just kind of take that right there. That our hope is anchored in the historical reality of the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. That the proclamation of the empty tomb is one of those evidences, one of those ideas that forms the bedrock. So then he goes on, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you. See, that's our hope. That what Jesus has done has opened a door not only to how we live, but where we're going. And that hope becomes an important goal for the direction of our lives. So maybe even think about the question as being, why are you going to heaven? Can you imagine the opportunity to deal with that? Now, think about the setting here. We're going to just make one point here and then close. But think about the setting here as Peter is pointing to it. As, all right, here is the Christian that is dealing, maybe a slave, who's dealing with persecution and opposition from their master, dealing with a difficult situation, and just keeps on going with their faith. And the master says, why do you keep putting up with this? You know, kind of like Job's wife, why don't you just curse God and die? And the answer is because I have a living hope. I have a Savior. I have a Lord. And I'm not giving that up for anything or anyone. Chaz chosen a song for us to close with, and I think it's a really appropriate one, with the idea of being ready to give an answer. And it asks the questions. Will you not tell it today? Let's stand as we sing.